Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 752 lecture. So this is our first week of a multi-week exploration into online access. So this lecture will introduce some topics and areas of discussion that we will follow up in subsequent weeks. So yeah, this is just kind of an introduction to some of the things that we'll talk about during the rest of this module. Okay, so our weekly topics for this week are: how do reference and outreach considerations influence how archives provide access to archival materials? How can online access serve as an advocacy tool for archives? And which types of archival infrastructure does online access require? So we'll start by talking about what I mean by online access. So there's two components of online access, or at least two components that we'll discuss in this course. Digital collections, which we'll discuss for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll also touch on online findings. And so these are the two aspects of online discussion that we will focus on. Of course, there are a multitude of issues and areas of consideration that you can tie into both of these aspects of online access, and again, that's something that we'll discuss for the rest of this course. Okay, so we'll talk about some connections between outreach and researcher services, which we've already discussed in this course, and online access, which of course will be the topic for, as I said, the next few weeks. So there are ways in which these different topics overlap each other and which they all overlap together. So for instance, when you are looking at researcher services and online access, which are facilitated to, as we'll talk about in just a second, to enhance the use of archival materials, that's something that you want to document when you are evaluating and sort of codifying the results of your researcher services efforts, as well as your online access efforts. So you want to have some tangible proof that your researcher services efforts are paying off and that your online access resources are being used as well. All three of these topics require planning and the establishment of goals. So you really need to know what your goals for online access are. Who are you trying to reach? How are you trying to reach them? Are you trying to facilitate access to particular collections within your repository? And this, of course, echoes a theme that we've talked a lot about in this class, that goals need to be established before or even during the implementation of outreach and researcher services as well. So there has to be some kind of planning in place, some goals in mind. Otherwise, efforts in outreach, researcher services, and online access can end up being sort of sporadic and ad hoc and not really focused on getting the most tangible and beneficial results that an archives may hope for and expect when they are putting resources into these different activities. Related to this planning and establishment of goals, all three of these topics require knowledge of sort of who is the audience, who is the target, who is the sort of imagined user or the imagined viewer. And that relates to something that we talked about, especially with researcher services, is knowing how researchers carry out research and as much as possible, shaping your research or services to reflect that. And as we'll discuss in just a second, that is the case with online access as well. Evaluation should be a key part of all of these three processes as well. So you need to constantly be evaluating whether or not you are reaching the goals that you have set. Is your online access facilitating access to your materials, or is it maybe set up in a way that actually creates a barrier between your materials and researchers, and that's causing them to turn away and not use your materials? So again, as we've discussed before, this evaluation is meant to determine if archives are throwing good money after bad, and if there is room for improvement, steps that archives can take in order to make sure that outreach is working better, or researcher services is working better, or online access is working better as well. Each of these activities require and contribute to archival infrastructure, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit. So nothing is free, right? And so again, that goes back to the need of having goals and evaluating how these processes are being carried out to make sure that you're getting a good sort of bang for your buck. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, there are some connections between online access and a couple of terms that we talked about when we discussed researcher services, namely the principle of least effort and this idea of berry picking, this information-seeking behavior that researchers carry out when they are discovering materials that meet their information need. So definitely some overlaps between those processes in research services and online access as well. Next, we'll talk about some general goals of online access. So to highlight valuable collection materials, to support the use of materials, to meet researcher needs / expectations, to project value and legitimacy, to expand the area of use, and to provide materials researchers use to form their own conclusions. And if these goals are met and this success can be documented by archives, then these are great tools for advocacy. They show a level of success and accomplishment that can be appealing to stakeholders, to resource allocators, and archives can use success in these areas to make a case for greater resources to use when carrying out record-keeping activities. So obviously, if an archive's online access and results in use of materials, or maybe increased use of materials, then that can lead to the direct and indirect uses that we talked about in this course. And we discussed how they can be critical advocacy tools. If online access can help an archives protect value and legitimacy, that's something that can be used for both internal and external outreach. If you go to an archive's online collections and it looks like it was slapped together by, a class of 8th graders, not to diminish, the intelligence of 8th graders, but they're probably not the best equipped people to develop and support online access in an archive, then that might make you question the value and legitimacy of the archive that you're looking at. If you go to online collections and they are polished, they're well, they're configured well, they feature tools and resources that are helpful to researchers, then that is really going to increase the likelihood that a researcher is going to have a favorable impression of an archive, because it sort of demonstrates a basic level of competence, a basic understanding of what researchers want, and that can definitely cast things in a favorable light. If online access helps an archives highlight valuable collection materials, then that can demonstrate to resource allocators and to researchers as well that the archive contains holdings that are relevant and have sort of contemporary value and are useful to researchers, and not just sort of things that no one really thinks about or cares about. So there are a variety of different ways in which these goals can really cast archives favorably, and a variety of ways in which they can support the overall goal of archives to develop and use advocates to increase the level of support that an archive receives. It's important to note that to a certain degree, placing records in an online environment, say in the form of an online collection, can result in some loss. So when you compare looking at something online versus holding it in your hands and actually seeing and feeling the original record, that's not, as the Green and Lantern article notes on page 760, that's not the most comprehensive researcher experience. So you lose kind of the touch and feel appeal, which can in some ways drive the appreciation of records that researchers and the general public have. But you can argue that the benefits of digital access outweigh these losses. So the ease at which researchers can access these materials, even if they can't sort of touch and feel them, smell that old paper smell that we all know and love. Just the ease of access that online collections can afford can be more beneficial for archives and more beneficial for researchers as well in a lot of instances. As we've talked about before, oftentimes people value what's easy, what's convenient, and online access can certainly be that, assuming it's done well. And so, researchers may be willing to kind of overlook not being able to interact with the real thing, or maybe even something that facilitates them actually going and seeing the real record, so they get that experience anyway. So there's always sort of a give and take and pros and cons, but generally speaking, archival online access and online collections, the benefits are going to be really powerful for archives and for researchers as well. One of the big benefits of online access is that it can provide the virtual reunification that the Green and Lantern article discusses on page 761. So this idea of taking records which may be dispersed, collections which may be dispersed, to produce what the authors describe, quoting Ricardo Punzalan, as a consolidated, digitized representation of scattered artifacts, literary and artistic works, and/or archival records of a single origin or common provenance. And obviously that can be profoundly beneficial for researchers, because it can take the papers of an individual who may be scattered in archival collections around the country or around the world, and allow them to be reassembled in an online access setting. And that can make the process of discovering more information about a particular person or maybe even a particular event, if you're looking at developing contextual relationships even between different collections, a whole lot easier for researchers to carry out. And rather than having to go from archive to archive to archive to find all these scattered bits of information. They can access them pretty simply and hopefully pretty efficiently from the comfort of their own home. And so this can be something that, we talked about pros and cons just a little bit ago, but this can be a powerful positive for archival collections if this kind of reunification can happen. The Green and Lampkin article notes that this is a type of online access that relies heavily both on technology and cross-institutional and interdisciplinary collaboration. And so we'll talk more about infrastructure later on in this lecture, but right here we see two big types of archival infrastructure that we've discussed. So, obviously technology is something that requires expertise to sort of corral and use in a useful way. It may require collaborating with IT staff within an organization. So that's sort of one example of the cross-institutional collaboration that virtual reunification requires, and also interdisciplinary collaboration. So working with scholars, perhaps in other fields, or even a variety of fields, to make sure that the virtual reunifications that archivists provide and facilitate through their online collections and other online access means is factual, and the connections that archives make between different collections or between different records is actually supported by factual connections, and isn't something that is going to lead researchers astray and down a path that isn't actually logical or truthful. So again, if done correctly, if done through collaborations with scholars and other experts in the varying fields that archivists are working with when they carry out these virtual reunifications, this can be a really powerful tool to enhance discovery and access, and one that can support a variety of information-seeking behaviors. It can support berry picking, but also make berry picking a more efficient process. So also support this idea of the principle of least effort. And we'll talk about some more connections between online access and these two information-seeking behaviors in just a minute. We also have to talk about the collaboration between archives and relationships between other archives to make this kind of project happen as well. Archives have to be willing to play ball and to sort of have crosswalks between different digital collections, which might be related to an individual, maybe to scan records or digitize records that aren't currently online, to make this kind of virtual reunification, if not possible, then more meaningful. And so that is another type of infrastructure as well, just these partnerships between archives. And again, one that can really facilitate a project like this being carried out in a meaningful way. So as we've touched on in this lecture, a key part of online access is collaboration, or this idea of working with researchers to make sure that records placed online and finding aids placed online as well are structured in a way that facilitates the use of archival materials. Green and Lampron on page 763 state that as specialized digital collections expand in content and structural design, scholars contribute important expertise in selection, co-location, interpretation, and integration of the sources they study. So it's really important that archives recognize the value of harnessing this expertise and these sources of information. And that's something that Green and Lampron also talk about on page 761. They quote a study by the Association for Research Libraries, which states that without the guiding voices of scholars, the tremendous effort now being devoted to digitizing our cultural heritage could in fact impede, not facilitate future research. And Green and Lampron really call on archivists to investigate researcher practices as a very important aspect in how online collections, and you could say online finding aids as well, are developed. And so the idea here is that as much as possible, online resources such as online collections and online finding aids mirror as much as possible the current or maybe even ideal information-seeking behaviors of researchers. And, you know, a key part of that is, as we've talked about before, finding out what researchers want, finding out how researchers engage in research, and using that information to shape what online access in an archive looks like. And, you know, Green and Lampron say that if archives don't do that, then essentially they're spending a lot of resources into something which can actually make difficult or make access more frustrating or more difficult, which, you know, is a huge waste. And this is obviously something that could happen on the front end as online access tools are being developed, or something that could happen once things are available to researchers and, you know, people have more of a perspective on what's working, what isn't working. So this type of collaboration can be something that, as I said, sort of exists before these projects are developed, or something that exists, you know, further on down the road. And, you know, probably ideally both of those are happening. So there's collaboration with researchers and scholars on the front end, and then sort of some sort of recurring evaluation that occurs as these tools are sort of developed and used further on down the line, so that we are getting kind of a constantly informed perspective on how well your online access tools are facilitating access. An example of this proactive collaboration or proactive understanding of researcher behavior and how researchers are interacting with materials is mentioned in the Smith article, when the authors talk about how in the Women Veterans collection, the curator involved in this project learned that researchers were accessing the collection through a basic online search, and they shifted practices to reflect that knowledge. So again, just sort of having an understanding of where your researchers are coming from, what they're looking for, and using that knowledge to shape the decisions that you make when organizing and putting online assets into place. And so, again, this is such a vital tool for archives if they want to have online access tools that do facilitate use and do portray archives in a sort of legitimate and positive light. if you are working with scholars and you're working with researchers and getting this information, and you do have online access tools that does reflect their information seeking behavior and allows them to find and use the information that they want to in a fairly painless way, then that's going to make it more likely that they're going to continue to use your uh, your online access resources, and they're going to be able to use them in a way which actually results in some sort of product that is going to benefit them and is going to benefit the archives when the archives can point at the products of research as reasons for why the archive should be supported. If researchers run into online access tools that are poorly designed because the needs of researchers weren't sought out or weren't listened to, if this collaboration and listening didn't take place, then that's where the principle of least effort can rear its ugly head, and researchers might say, well, this is just too frustrating to wade through, so I'm not able to do what I want with these records that I'm seeing. I'm not able to, slog through all the jargon in this finite to discover what I'm looking for, so I'm just going to kind of move on. And another information seeking behavior that we've talked about is berry picking. So the idea of working with researchers and understanding the berry picking process that they go through, and again, as much as possible, having online access tools that support this, whether it's through virtual reunification that makes this type of berry picking more efficient, whether it's through making sure that you have metadata that allows researchers to navigate across collections and across records really well. That is a very important thing to have in place if you want to support this berry picking process. And the sort of the easier, more intuitive you can make this, the easier it's going to be for researchers to use your records. So there really is a strong connection between information seeking behavior and what online access should look like. And again, archives may not have much clue about what information seeking behavior is when it comes to the use of online resources unless they actually stop and collaborate and listen, to quote the immortal words of Vanilla Ice. So it's just a highly important thing to do. It's something that we've mentioned throughout this course, and this is just another example of why this type of relationship is important and worthy of the effort and resources that goes into it. So we've also talked about the difference between research services and reference services, and by engaging in the type of collaboration that we just talked about, again, you can argue that that is much more focused on this research services orientation, where you are focused on use as the main rationale for what archives are doing. So if you collaborate, then you really are saying, we are here for the use of our materials, and we want to support that as much as possible. You're saying the information that we get from our researchers is essential to what our planning for our online access is going to look like. You're saying that we value gathering and analyzing the information that we're getting from researchers, either directly or maybe just by tracking sort of how people move through your online collections. That could be another important evaluative tool that could be gathered systematically. And you really are focused on promoting use and having finding aids and other services geared towards the needs of researchers. I say researchers instead of users because I know I just don't like the term users, so I'm kind of changing a little bit of text here, but you get the idea. And as we've talked about before, this is an orientation which makes it much more likely that an archives is going to be able to succeed in what it's doing, that it's going to be able to provide the rationale for why it should be supported, and it's going to be able to hopefully be more successful at acquiring the resources that it needs to be successful in the future. So you can connect these all to this idea of advocacy. So if you consult with researchers and you implement what you find through this consultation, then you're going to have online resources that have more of a positive impact on the community, and that is going to create more advocacy opportunities for your repository. Now, as I have mentioned here, these things take infrastructure, but the idea is that the advocacy that you build by carrying out these processes will result in you gaining more resources than you're expending. Again, you won't know unless you are engaging in evaluation, but that's sort of the idea here. And we'll talk more about impact in a couple of weeks. But for now, I want to focus on the different types of infrastructure that can be involved with developing online access tools. So to do that, we'll look at our list of infrastructure types here. So again, leadership, resources, staff, facilities, holdings, policies, placement of the archives, which, as you know, is something that I really like to focus on and will focus on in just a little bit. Organizational culture, planning systems, relationships, which is another one that I've touched on that I think is overlooked and can be really important, and reliability of revenue sources. Now, we won't go through all of these. You could argue that really all of these, to a certain degree, are connected to online access, but there are a couple of them that I'm more interested in focusing on for the sake of brevity, and some of them are more represented in our readings for this week, especially the Smith article, and so that will be kind of the main focus of the rest of this lecture. So we'll start by looking at resources and staff. Just sort of generally speaking, obviously it takes staff members to digitize records. It takes staff members to carry out the archival processes, the record keeping processes that at least ideally precede placing materials online. And a big part of these processes, as the Smith article argues, is processing archival collections. And the Smith article really makes the case that collections need to be processed before digital access can be successful, and that this results in better selection, better metadata, and better connections between physical and digital records. So there were a couple of the case studies in that article where the arrangement and description either wasn't done or wasn't done well, and that resulted in some headaches down the road for the people involved in these projects when they tried to place these records online. And it's also important to include the expertise of staff. So the Smith article talks about how in one of the case studies, there was some sort of low quality processing work that had been done, some things that were folded incorrectly, some things that were described sort of incorrectly or inconsistently, and that made the process of placing records online more difficult than it needed to be. So not just that there's staff to carry out these activities, but that these staff are fairly qualified. The Smith article also talks about how in some cases grant funding may shift digitization priorities. It may shift how online access is carried out and sort of what it looks like. And so that kind of ties into the resources aspect of infrastructure. It may be, as in the Smith article, that archives have to, or I guess are encouraged to place records online, which maybe might not be the best collection or the collection that is most ready to be placed online, but there may be incentives for them to kind of bite the bullet a little bit and go ahead and do that. So if you are able to get grant funding to place something online, that grant has maybe a limited time frame in which a project needs to be done, then you may say, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and take advantage of this opportunity and sort of grind this out. And obviously, you need resources to buy things like scanners and other things that are needed for online access as well, especially when you're talking about digitization. But yeah, resources and just the staff to have the time to engage in these types of projects can be a pretty meaningful type of infrastructure. The Smith article talks about how they eventually hired an archivist, which was just a photo archivist, to work on the project related to university buildings. So it seems like before that hire took place, they didn't have someone who really had the time to devote as much energy to that project as maybe needed to be done. So yeah, archives are usually short-staffed, and a lack of this infrastructure can definitely intrude on an archive's ability to provide access to online records. And so the last two that we'll talk about are relationships and the placement of an archives within an organization, and relatedly, an archive's freedom of action. And this was one that the Smith article focused on a fair amount as well. And there were some instances where, especially early on, the archives didn't have a whole lot of say in some of the decisions that were made surrounding the online access that was being attempted. And that in some ways, the archives were more marginalized passengers to these projects, which involve records, were coming from the archives. So essentially, we're going to take these resources from your archive, but you're not really going to have any say in what we do with these archives. And that's like a pretty powerless position to be in, right? And it's a position that suggests that the input and judgment and inside of archives isn't really valued. Archives aren't considered to be important enough to be a part of these projects, and it really does suggest that the archives aren't thought of as being a worthy contributor to what's going on with their own records. So yeah, that's a pretty marginalized position, and obviously one that suggests a lack of advocacy in the past, which has led to archives not being valued, not being sought after as collaborators in these projects. And as the Smith article notes, this lack of collaboration resulted in a lot of difficulties. So they weren't involved with content selection. They weren't involved with metadata standards. They didn't really have much say in which digital asset platform was being used. And that resulted in some problems further on down the road. And it really diminished maybe not the final quality of the project, because once the archives got involved, it seems like things were fixed, but ideally you want to do it right the first time, and that could have been done if archives had more of a seat at the table. And the Smith article notes that digitization requires a partnership among information professionals during most phases of the project, from material selection to metadata creation to building a user-friendly, searchable online interface. And it does suggest that the archive's expertise in maybe the best materials to include in online collections. So you can't scan everything, but maybe archives who have worked with these records in the past know what are the most important, however many records are that should be included. So sort of the creme de la creme. Non-experts may not really understand the importance of metadata or the different metadata standards out there that should be used to facilitate online access. And so that's an area of expertise that archives can provide as well. They may not have as much insight into information seeking behavior as archives ideally have, and tools related to things like researcher-friendly tools, better search tools, downloads of higher quality images, which the Smith article mentions, may not be a consideration by people who don't have this experience working with researchers and knowing what researchers want and how researchers navigate to the information that they're seeking. So there are a lot of benefits for archives getting involved, but unless people have a perception that archives sort of know what they're doing and can provide a useful perspective, then there might be little incentive or little desire to include archives in these discussions. And so again, it just goes back to the importance of archives engaging in advocacy and working to make sure that people feel like archives do deserve a seat at the table, and that archival participation in these types of projects can result in a smoother and more efficient process for everyone involved. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. As I said, there are obviously other types of infrastructure that are involved with online access as well. But I think those are 4 of the more important ones to focus on. So we'll just kind of leave it at that. But as I mentioned, a lot of these discussions are ones that we'll continue on with during our analysis of online access. So this is just sort of setting the stage for some other things that we'll address. Specifically, we'll look more at impact and how that is important to measure and how that can be used to advocate for archives. We'll look at some of the features that online collections can and should have to make them more appealing and intuitive for researchers. So we'll kind of continue on with a lot of the discussions that we began having today. So thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and take care.